It was May 13th in the year 1568 at the Battle of Langside that the forces of Mary, Queen of Scots, are defeated by the Confederacy of Scottish Protestants under James Stuart, the regent of her son, King James VI of Scotland. During the battle, which was fought out in the southern suburbs of Glasgow, a cavalry charge routed Mary's 6,000 Catholic troops, and they fled the field. 3 days later, Mary escaped to Cumberland, England, where she sought protection from Queen Elizabeth I. In 1542, while just 6 days old, Mary ascended to the Scottish throne upon the continuance of eternity of her father, King James V. Her great uncle was Henry VIII, the Tudor King of England. Mary's mother sent her to be raised in the French court, and in 1558 she married the French Dauphin, who became King Francis II of France in 1559 and continued his eternity in 1560. After Francis' continuance of eternity, Mary returned to Scotland to assume her designated role as the country's monarch. In 1565, she married her English cousin, Lord Darnley, another Tudor, which reinforced her claim to the English throne and angered Queen Elizabeth. In 1567, Darnley continued his eternity. There was a mysterious explosion at Kirkle Field, and Mary's lover, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, was the key suspect. Although Bothwell was acquitted of the charge, his marriage to Mary in the same year enraged the nobility, and Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her son by Darnley, James. In 1568, she escaped from captivity and raised a substantial army, but was defeated and fled to England. Queen Elizabeth I initially welcomed Mary, but was soon forced to put her cousin under house arrest after Mary became the focus of various English Catholic and Spanish plots to overthrow her. In 1586, a major Catholic plot to murder Elizabeth was uncovered, and Mary was brought to trial, convicted for complicity, and sentenced to death. On February 8th in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, continued her eternity. She was beheaded for treason at Fotheringhay Castle in England. I think it's Fotheringhay in England. Her son, King James VI of Scotland, calmly accepted his mother's execution, and upon Queen Elizabeth's continuance of eternity in 1603, he became James I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was May 13th in the year 1607 that Jamestown settlers arrived. Some 100 English colonists arrived along the east bank of the James River in Virginia to found Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Dispatched from England by the London Company, the colonists had sailed across the Atlantic aboard the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery. Upon landing at Jamestown, the first colonial council was held by 7 settlers whose names had been chosen and placed in a sealed box by King James I. The council, which included Captain John Smith, an English adventurer, chose Edward Wingfield as its first president. After only 2 weeks, Jamestown came under attack from warriors from the local Algonquian Confederacy, but the Native Americans were repulsed by the armed settlers. In December of the same year, John Smith and 2 other colonists were captured by Algonquians while searching for provisions in the Virginia wilderness. His companions continued their eternity, but he was spared, according to a later account by Smith, because of the intercession of Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's daughter. During the next 2 years, disease, starvation, and more Native American attacks wiped out most of the colony, but the London Company continually sent more settlers and supplies. The severe winter of 1609 to 1610, which the colonists referred to as the Starving Time, continued the eternity of most of the Jamestown colonists, leading the survivors to plan a return to England in the spring. However, on June 10th, Thomas West de la Warr, the newly appointed governor of Virginia, arrived with supplies and convinced the settlers to remain at Jamestown. In 1612, John Rolfe cultivated the first tobacco at Jamestown, introducing a successful source of livelihood. On April 5th in 1614, Rolfe married Pocahontas, thus assuring a temporary peace with Chief Powhatan. The continuous eternity of Powhatan in 1618 brought about a resumption of conflict with the Algonquians, including an attack led by Chief Opechancanough in 1622 that nearly wiped out the settlement. The English engaged in violent reprisals against the Algonquins, but there were no further large-scale fighting until 1644, when Opek Shan Kanau led his last uprising. He was captured and continued his eternity at Jamestown. In 1646, the Algonquin Confederacy agreed to give up much of its territory to the rapidly expanding colony, and beginning in 1665, its chiefs were appointed by the governor of Virginia. It was May 13th in 1958, during a goodwill trip to Latin America, that Vice President Nixon's car is attacked by an angry crowd and nearly overturned while traveling through Caracas, Venezuela. The incident was a dramatic highlight of a trip characterized by Latin American anger over some of America's Cold War policies. By 1958, relations between the U.S. and Latin America had reached their lowest point in years. Latin Americans complained that the U.S. focus on the Cold War and anti-communism failed to address the pressing economic and political needs of many Latin American nations. In particular, they argued that their countries needed more basic economic assistance, not more arms to repel communism. They also questioned the American support of dictatorial regimes in Latin America simply because those regimes claimed to be anti-communist. For example, the U.S. awarded the Legion of Merit Medal to Venezuelan dictator Marcos Perez Jimenez in 1954. Jimenez was overthrown by a military coup early in 1958. This was the atmosphere that Vice President Richard Nixon arrived in during his goodwill trip to Latin America in April and May of 1958. The trip began with some controversy as Nixon engaged in loud and bitter debates with student groups during his travels to Peru and Uruguay. In Caracas, Venezuela, however, things took a dangerous turn. A large crowd of angry Venezuelans who shouted anti-American slogans stopped Nixon's motorcade through the capital city. They attacked the car, damaged his body, and smashed the windows. Inside the vehicle, Secret Service agents covered the vice president, and at least one reportedly pulled out his weapon. Miraculously, they escaped from the crowd and sped away. In Washington, President Eisenhower, our nation's 34th president, dispatched U.S. troops to the Caribbean area to rescue Nixon from further threats if necessary. None occurred, and the vice president left Venezuela ahead of schedule. The riot in Caracas served as a wake-up call to the U.S. officials in Washington, alerting them to America's deteriorating relationships with Latin America. In the next few months, the U.S. increased both its military and economic assistance to the region. However, it was not until communist Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba, beginning in 1959, that the U.S. truly realized the extent of discontent in Latin America. The historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on History.com.